Good evening. Once again, this year is dedicated Schus Cakiva Gershon נחum for Shlema. Take it from Yad Mamish. We're now at the sixth and final, at long last, the final installment of this series we've been doing about Kiddush between 6 and 7. Taking a deep dive into this, down this rabbit hole. And I think now that we have all that background, we can come back up for air and try to make a seder here and figure out what's what and what the Rebbe is saying and the practical implications for us. So, as we've discussed at length, we went through last time the background, how the Rebbe's answers on the subject played out. Originally, there's the letters from Tafshin Tazayin. Then there was the Kiddush that was published. The letters of Tafshin Tazayin created a sort of tension, a confusion, whether, because the Rebbe says that it's talking about full minutes, even minutes of hours, even hours of 60 minutes. And they're measured from chatzos, which, as we've discussed at length, is somewhat contradictory, because if you measure from chatzos, it can't be exactly 60-minute hours, and if it's 60-minute hours, you can't measure from actual chatzos, since chatzos varies from day to day, about a minute, a little less than a minute. But so the question is, which do you take literally, and which do you take as lav dafka? Either you say that the hour is 60 minutes plus minus second, which or 2 seconds, which over the course of the 24 hours can add up to close to a minute, or the Rebbe meant by chatzos. That doesn't mean literally the chatzos of every day, but the average chatzos on soy. So this caused a big debate about this, various opinions we went through, and then Ramesh Levertov published his Yichidus that the Rebbe told him, negate nach ein Zeger, aber man hitzach, that we follow the clock, but we're careful. And that itself was a bit enigmatic. And then that added a third position to the debate, that maybe we don't care when actual chatzos is or average chatzos. We just look at the clock and 6 to 7, and that's that. So when this was published, there were various articles. We went through all this last time. I don't want to repeat everything, but just bekitzer. So when Rav Shlomo Razov wrote an article about it, arguing that it refers to chatzos on soy, whereas about 11 argued the other way. And when Rav Shlomo's article, together with the Yichidus, were meant to be published, they were submitted to the Rebbe. The galleys were always submitted to the Rebbe before, and that's where we got the answers that are the most important answers for understanding the Rebbe Shitta, which we went through last time at length. There was the brief answer that the Rebbe answered to Rebbe 11's zettel, and then the Rebbe wrote a tshuva, a letter styled as a letter addressing the issue in detail. So we discussed last time. I just want to come back to this because I have gotten some probably a few people asked me to clarify this further. Where do we see that the Rebbe is saying that the Rebbe was shoyul the minhag pill, and also why did the Rebbe learn the Rebbe this way? What forces the Rebbe to learn the Rebbe in a way that he's negating the minhag? So I just want to go over that briefly, and then we'll move further. So the Rebbe writes in this letter, the Rebbe is completely shoyul the day that it means literally the clock, that you follow whatever clock is on the wall. So as we saw in the zettel, Rebbe 11 presented 3 options. The Rebbe crossed out that option, and the Rebbe said that really should be according to chatzos amiti, the true chatzos of each Friday. However, what I've seen done by the masses is by chatzos and soy, by the average chatzos. So that was the bottom line, and then we had, we didn't go back to Rebbe's other answer about this. So I'm going to share the screen here. So the question becomes, why is the Rebbe forced to learn the Alter Rebbe in such a way that the Alter Rebbe is being shelu the minhag? And that's in the letter to Eretz Yisrael, where somebody asked the Rebbe about, there was an opinion, I believe it was the Sadiguri Rebbe who wrote this, that in Eretz Yisrael, B'chal, this doesn't apply, the Rebbe will shelu that, but then the Rebbe said that if taka, that's the minhag, that was practice, so we have the Shem of Sayim Hashem, and especially since the Alter Rebbe himself is shelu the minhag in Shulchan Aruch. So, and let's see here, let me share the screen. I'm not good at the Zoom stuff. Let's see, share screen, there we go. PDF, there we go. Okay, so we have, let's see what I'm sharing, here we go. Okay, so the Rebbe writes that, how do we, also in Shulchan Aruch, over here, the Alter Rebbe was careful in his lashon, yeshnis harim chul, that some are careful, and then further on, the Alter Rebbe says that we already explained that you should make Kiddush right as soon as you come home, even if it's still day. And the Rebbe is adding, even though sometimes the person will come home, it'll be in this hour between 6 and 7. And then the Rebbe goes on about the reason for not being makabel the minhag could be because Shem Mitzvah is a Davara, and also there's we know the Shem Sayim Hashem, etc., etc. So let's look back at the Alter Rebbe and see why the Rebbe is forced to learn the Alter Rebbe this way. So we saw already Sif Beis, where the Alter Rebbe says that everybody should make Kiddush as early as possible. As soon as they come home, you should make Kiddush right away, even though it's still daytime, in order to be Kiddush and to be Mekadesh Samoch Misase. Although the Alter Rebbe brings down the Rameh Mifano that one can wait if he's not hungry, nevertheless, Mitzvah Min HaMucher is to make Kiddush right away. Now, the following Sif, so let's learn it inside again and try to understand why, because we saw that, we saw in other sources that others did learn the Alter Rebbe in a way that it's not negating the minhag. We saw last week how there's a way to learn the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe is saying that I already told you to make Kiddush before, so you don't have this issue. So let's see it inside. Some are careful not to make Kiddush in the first hour of the night. Now we have these parenthetical, that this Shah Rishena of the night means not the typical, when we say the first hour of the night, the first hour after Shkia. Rather, it means the 7th hour of Shai Shabbos after Chatzos, as will be explained in Siman Tav Chav Ches, which the Rebbe we saw already explains why the Alter Rebbe is referring to Ochas Kiddush HaChidush, that where we look at Chatzos as the cutoff point, and even though it's a Malach Hamtzai, and we went through that 2 shiurim ago, I believe. But that there you see the Rebbe's Alter Rebbe is referring to Kiddush HaChidush, that we follow that we count the hours after Chatzos. So going back, so if we read it together without the parenthetical again, so either you make Kiddush before nighttime, which we saw is what the Tikkunei Shabbos says, and in light of the Tikkunei Shabbos, we saw the Magen Avraham brings it down that way, that you should be careful not to make Kiddush, but rather to make Kiddush before the first hour of the night. As we saw, that Tikkunei Shabbos presents it as a positive, not just as a negative thing, but also a positive, that you want to make Kiddush in the time of Tzedek, so that the Tumah, because it's the Tumah Vachim, and Tzedek and Maidim, so that way, Ba'kar Chayana Amen, the Samach Mem will answer Amen to the bracha of the Malach of Tzedek. So the whole vert was to make Kiddush before the 7th hour. But here the Alter Rebbe shifts to, as we saw in the Eila Shabbos, a different way of seeing this whole minhag as avoiding that hour. Why? Because the first hour of the night is the mazel of Maidim, and the Samach Mem governs over it. And we already explained one should make Kiddush as soon as he comes home from shul while it's still day. So one reasonable way of learning this is that you would think that it would be possible to learn this. That the Alter Rebbe is saying, yes, there's a minhag not to make Kiddush between 6 and 7. Nevertheless, and even if you waited, it's already, if you missed the boat, then it's already 6, wait till 7, as the Eila Shabbos says. Nevertheless, we already explained that the real way to do it, the best way to do it, Chatchila, is to make Kiddush before nighttime, and then you don't have an issue altogether. Because that also corresponds with the Magen Avraham and the Tikkun Shabbos. So that was basically saying that 2 points. First, again, this is the Kasaka Daita, the way we could have learned, and we can explain why it's not that way. But we could have learned that either, that I'm saying that though there's the Zahirus, as the Eila Shabbos says, not to make Kiddush between 6 and 7, either before, or to make Kiddush either before or after. Nevertheless, ideally, you want to make Kiddush before 6, and then you avoid any issue. Sai mitzad, because we said already that's mitzvah namuvchar Kaddish samuch knisasei, and Sai, although the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention it, but you also on the way you also gain that your Yetzer, the whole point of the Eilish of the Tikkun Shabbos, that we dafke make Kiddush before Laila. Now, so this would be a reasonable way of learning this, and we already saw that. Let's look at it inside once again. We had, so we went through, please. So, anyway, so we would have to go over it inside. We already went through it last time, but we saw that there is a way to learn the Alter Rebbe that way. Now, the problem is, if you learn the Alter Rebbe that way, you're forced to learn in a way that the Alter Rebbe is talking about Yom HaShabim. Why? Because if it's not Yom HaShabim, where Shkia is at exactly 6 o'clock, astronomical time, of course, then it doesn't make sense, because the Alter Rebbe is saying, we already told you to make Kiddush before, but when it's still day, before Shkia, so then you won't have this issue. But what do you mean you won't have this issue? Because the 6 and 7 has nothing to do with Shkia. So it just doesn't add up. So one way of learning that is that, like Machzah Shekel learned the Magen Avraham, and the Tikkun Shabbos, and the whole this whole minhag, Machzah Shekel limits it only to Yom HaShavim. And Yom HaShavim, if you make Kiddush from Ba'id Yom, you avoid the whole issue, and you don't have to deal with this. However, there's a big problem with that, because the Alter Rebbe, we know, of course, is very, very careful in his language, and Alter Rebbe doesn't mention anything at all about Yom HaShavim. Alter Rebbe says it as a pashta thing. I see why I opened by mistake the wrong version of the first version of the Sourcebook. So let me get that back up. So it's very hard to learn that into the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe is only talking about Yom HaShavim, and the Alter Rebbe doesn't even mention it. I mean, it's a question of how we can learn that way, but especially in the Alter Rebbe is so careful in his so precise in his language, and so it's it's only talking about Yom HaShavim. So that apparently that's why the Rebbe does not want to learn it that way. So instead, the Rebbe seems to be learning that when it says Laila here and and it says and then when it says Yom in the end, the Laila and Yom are not flip sides of each other. We're talking about a different kind of Laila and a different kind of Yom. Why? Because when we're talking about Laila, we're talking about, as we saw at length in the Tzemach Tzedek HaKadmin, and before that in Maril, they explained that Laila is defined for purposes of Mazalis as 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Whereas here, when Alter Rebbe is saying Kaddish miyad b'veim beis haknesses b'eid yom, that's talking about when you daven ma'ariv b'eid yom before Shkia after Paga Mincha, you daven ma'ariv and you come home and you make Kiddush dafka before Shkia. So the Yom and Laila aren't flip sides of each other, which makes this a little tricky to understand this whole seif. So what's the result? Once you realize that, so then Alter Rebbe is saying yes, meaning from 6 to 7, whenever that is throughout the year, either an hour before or an hour after. But then the Alter Rebbe is saying, but I already told you that you should make Kiddush as soon as you come home, which is before Shkia. Now that could obviously be between 6 and 7 too, right? Because especially in Russia and the northern areas, at times Paga Mincha could actually be after 6 to begin with. But even in here in New York, for example, where Paga Mincha is never after 6, as far as I remember, it's never after 7. I'm sorry. I believe Paga Mincha is never after 7, certainly after 6. So nevertheless, you still have to go to shul, daven ma'ariv, come home. So, and that I was telling you, as soon as you get home, make Kiddush. And so it's clear that it's going to be, sometimes it'll come out between 6 and 7. And nevertheless, the Rebbe is telling you, don't worry about it, make Kiddush right away. That seems the way to be how the Rebbe is, how and why the Rebbe is learning it this way. Now, Willie the Mistafina, I'm afraid to say that, but maybe V'derech Efsher, I was thinking that because it seems a little difficult to understand why the Alter Rebbe would phrase it that way, start off talking about Laila in one sense, and then switch over to Yom in a completely different sense. So perhaps we can say, there's a whole discussion, very controversial, about the Alter Rebbe's parentheses. Right? We know the Maru writes that the Alter Rebbe put into parentheses things that he wasn't sure about and wanted to come back to be Mevarer more. So when in doubt, Alter Rebbe put it in parentheses. So Rav Chaim Noah wrote at length about it, that proving that although whenever the Alter Rebbe is in doubt, he put into parentheses, that doesn't mean every parentheses means he was in doubt, because the vast majority of parentheses, that doesn't really make sense, that explanation with respect to them. Either they're parentheticals or they're all kinds of, there's many, he goes through at length different reasons why the Alter Rebbe would put something in parentheses. So, and he concludes that although everything in doubt is in parentheses, not everything in parentheses means that there was a doubt. And Bishol Munshan wrote about it at length as well in a sefer on the Alter Rebbe's Sfarim. So there are different kinds of parentheses, and they can be in parentheses for different reasons. Now, here the parentheses seems to be parenthetical explaining what Shar Shena Shalayla means. However, if you read the Sif, it seems to me, and again, I'm saying this very, very cautiously, this is pure speculation, but it seems to me that maybe the Alter Rebbe wrote the Sif originally without the parentheses, and this is basically almost identical to the Eila Shabbos, as we saw. Let me try to pull them up one next to each other. That way I can have them open together. Let's go to the Eila Shabbos here. Whoops. So if we compare the Lashon of the Eila Shabbos with Alter Rebbe, the Kaddish Kiddush Shikanas Mazel Maidim, Tchilas Shabbos Shamash Mazel Maidim, Samo Samachman Meshal, Ubshah Chen Shalav Shabbos, Shamash Mazel Tzedek, Malachit. So he explains that this is from the Tikkun Shabbos, and then he concludes Vinitev Shalei Kabbos Shabbos Kiddush Mishalas Harar Akum Mishalas Hatev. So now the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the harichas, the reason why, I mean, the Alter Rebbe brings about the Mazel Maidim and Samach Mem. He doesn't bring about the whole other side of it, the Mazel Tzedek. Nevertheless, but the Pearl, the Alter Rebbe is saying the same thing as the Eila Shabbos, that you should try to make Kiddush before, but not after. Well, I mean, I'm sorry, but if you missed it, not during that hour, you wait till after. So let's just try to read this if without the parentheses. There are some that are careful not to make Kiddush the first hour of the night. So it seems to be saying the same thing as the Eila Shabbos, that better to make Kiddush before you come home from shul. I'm sorry, right when you come home from shul. I probably a little out of it today. I'm not feeling so well, so keep tripping over my words. You make Kiddush as soon as you come home from shul. Nevertheless, if you didn't, you wait until 7. That would seem to be the way the Alter Rebbe originally wrote the Seif as the Shabbos. Now, then it seems the Alter Rebbe was Magia. Again, it's pure speculation, just a theory I'm throwing out there. That the Alter Rebbe was Magia based on the conundrum of the Machzas HaShekel. That if we're talking about the first hour of the night, what does that have to do with Mazois? Mazois, we know, follow fixed hours. So what does that have to do with making Kiddush before during the day? So then the Alter Rebbe adds this parentheses, this agah, maybe again speculating. The Hainu Shashvis Achatzes Hayom. Don't think that we're talking about the first hour of the night literally, that the first hour after Shkia, because as we've seen that there are plenty who did understand it that way, that it's talking about Chois Manis. So the Rebbe is negating that. No, it has to be talking about Chois Shabbos. But the minute Alter Rebbe was Magia, that the result is that, but the Alter Rebbe didn't take out the part though, right? That still stands. So that part is Gover, it supersedes the Chash of Mazel Maidim, apparently. So if you read the Seif this way, it seems that the Alter Rebbe's whole Hagah here in the parentheses is don't think that you could just make Kiddush before. No, the whole Zahirus is 7 hours after Chatzos, the 7th hour after Chatzos. But nevertheless, we already said the so that basically it comes out that by explaining the minhag, the Alter Rebbe is effectively negating it because we can't do both. You can't make Kiddush. I mean, not always, obviously. If you can, you can. So some times of the year it will be possible, but if you can't, you can't. So the Alter Rebbe is saying that although this Shah Shvius is necessarily has to mean Shah Shabbos, as we went through at great length in all the sources, and therefore it's from 6 to 7 after Chatzos. Nevertheless, I already told you, don't worry about it. Meaning that the mitzvah of the mitzvah of Kacheu Samuchu Knisasei trumps the chash of between 6 and 7. So that seems to me to be the way that the Rebbe is learning the Alter Rebbe, plus a little speculation about perhaps that this is a later Hagah that the Alter Rebbe added. But again, that's purely speculative. But anyway, but what comes out, the bottom line, that unless you stick into the Alter Rebbe that he has to be talking about only about Yom HaShavim, which is very far-fetched, we have no choice but to learn that these two goals are in conflict. The goal of not making Kiddush in the 7th hour and the goal of Kacheu Samach Knisasei, these two inyanim are in conflict. And when they are in conflict, the Alter Rebbe chooses Kacheu Samach Knisasei. Although, of course, the minhag in Lubavitch is not like it says in Shulchan Aruch, but rather we do follow this minhag. So that's as far as understanding the Alter Rebbe. Now let's go back to try to understand what the Rebbe was saying. Let's pull this up. Of course, we went through last time the beginning. So the beginning of Abraham, Taka tried to learn the Alter Rebbe like the Machzas HaShekel, but then he got into the whole problem of that we discussed. So he gave a whole different explanation. But the Rebbe, as we see, negates that. So as we go right there, so now the question is, we're left with a very big question. And this question, everybody who talks about this Indian always gets stuck on this question, and I haven't seen anyone really explain it in a satisfactory way. When the Rebbe is asked whether it should be from Chatzos Amtzoi or Chatzos Amiti, the Rebbe says, really, it should be from Chatzos Amiti. Nevertheless, we follow Chatzos. That's the minhag that I've seen is that people follow Chatzos Amtzoi. Now, based on everything we learned, that's really difficult to understand because we were the whole time we're talking about, and Shalom Marazov said it out very clearly in his Hara that we discussed, that was printed. That's what triggered this whole exchange that the Rebbe wrote the minus. He explained why it really should be Chatzos Amtzoi. So why is the Rebbe saying really it should be something else? Nevertheless, like a b'diavad, we do Chatzos Amtzoi. Why wouldn't the Rebbe just say that? Yeah, we follow Chatzei Samtzoi. What's the half a minute to follow? Not even a half a minute. The Rebbe saying the real way. It should be Chatzei Samiti. Why? So that's really it's a difficult question, and we're going to try to grapple with it. So before we come back to this question, I just want to say historically, I was told by Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yosef Posner told me that he remembers as a bacher in 770. There used to be a zettel every week that said what time 6 to 7 is based on Chatzei Samiti. They would hang up a note based on the Rebbe's earlier answers from Tafshin Tazayin. I guess that's what was known at the time, apparently. I mean, so he remembers that in the Lamids they had this zettel that every Erev Shabbos they would hang up a zettel based on what time Chatzos was that week, and 6 hours after that to 7 hours after that. Also, interestingly, people continued also after. I guess that stopped when the Rebbe's answer came out saying that we don't follow Chatzos Miti. Nevertheless, what did stick around is Dafka the third shitta that the Rebbe completely negated, which is negate Nachan Zeger. I guess based on Rabbi Shalavertav's Yichidus. I have no idea why, but Rabbi Zalman Shimon Dvarkin continued paskening that way and telling people that they should just follow the clock, to the point even that during daylight savings times, he said, we don't care, daylight savings, not daylight savings, time zone, not time zone, your clock says 6, until your clock says 7, that's all we care about. Which is hard to understand, but I guess it's based on his understanding of the Yechidus, and for whatever reason, he, as far as I know, he never changed it based on the Rebbe's later answers. I can't explain why. And Rabbi Shvei, who learned from Rabbi Zalman Shimon, continued also telling people that 6 to 7 means on the clock. So that there are plenty of people who still do it that way, who just do 6 to 7 based on their dining room clock. And interestingly, there's a other that was published on Sourcebook from Reb Leibel Groner, where he writes that the Rebbe always waited till 7 o'clock to make Kiddush. He doesn't say anything about Chatzos Samiti, Chatzos Samtzoi. He's coming to negate the Havamina that there could be something of Shai's Manias. The Rebbe is saying, no, I'm sorry. Reb Leibel Groner would say that the Rebbe waited till 7 o'clock. Now, this is talking about from after Chav Shvat, because before Chav Shvat, the Rebbe would go home in the earlier years, or from Aleph, I think the Rebbe started staying in the library, so the Rebbe would go over to the library. So, and the Rebbe would stay, after Ma'ariv, the Rebbe would go to his room and say, Ma'ariv Sedra, Piashmu at least. But the Rebbe would come out quite a while after Ma'ariv sometimes. It was always significantly after Ma'ariv, sometimes quite a while after Ma'ariv, till the Rebbe went home. So by the time the Rebbe never got home before 7 o'clock. But after Tafshin Ches, when the Rebbe made Kiddush in his room, the Rebbe sometimes made Kiddush earlier. And according to what was writing here, the Rebbe waited till 7 o'clock. I also heard from Mashbakim, who were by the Rebbe after Chav Zayin Adar, that when they poured the Rebbe Kiddush, the first week after the stroke, they set everything up. They poured it up a Kiddush, and the Rebbe's looking at the clock, and the Rebbe looked at the clock till 7 o'clock. The Rebbe didn't make Kiddush till the clock hit 7. So you see, there's still shaykhs to. I mean, I don't know if you could be medayik in that either. Maybe they just weren't medayik 7. Maybe the Rebbe was waiting for 6:56 as Chatzos. That's the Shashvis ends according to New York time. Very reasonable to assume that they weren't medactic in those 4 minutes. But anyway, that's just something I wanted to throw out there. And so now getting back, I'm sorry, we had a little digression there, but getting back to what we said, the question why the Rebbe is saying that really should be on Miti, but nevertheless we follow and sorry. So the only thing, I mean, I've seen some people try to answer it in ways that really don't add up. The only thing that I found that seems to offer some hint of an answer is this article that was published by Mendel Marazov, based on what he heard from his grandfather. So let's see it inside over here. So he starts off by saying that even according to the cheshbon of the hours, the Tosfos and Eruvin, we learned before is not sure about it, right? The Tesha starts off saying that how could it be Shoyz Manius, because then the Tkufa won't be a fixed length, it'll vary the length of the Tkufa. But then he goes on to, if it shows Shabbos, he asks other questions. So then we saw how the Yaakov answers it, but the point is that Tosfos was in doubt about it. So about Shoyz Manius, although there's a doubt, but the Rebbe clearly machriya against that. The Rebbe said that's Shoyz Shabbos. Nevertheless, about whether we count the cheshbon from Chatzos Amiti, so he's saying that contrary to what he himself wrote in that Yagdal Teira, that it should be Chatzos Amtzoi, he's saying that the Rebbe says no, really should be from Chatzos Amiti. Batam was a why. Shamazois shakech livachash shavsoy tzadik v'chuvu ain't sheisem kvi hashoyz amtzoyis elo kvi hilu chachama, because the hours of the mazois of the planets are not according to fixed hours of 60 minutes, but rather according to the path of the sun. So that's going back to the way we said, to what Rebbe 11 had written earlier, that 60 minutes is lav dafka. And again, this is all the way it theoretically should be, not the way we do a Rafael. Because every mazel is based on the time it takes the sun to traverse 15 degrees. In longitude. I'm sorry, in latitude. New York, 75 miles. New York, 90 miles. As is Shasha Mazbal Tzedek in New York, Shachama Elach Zamaila Erech Shechekim Tisha Miles Erech in New York, Ad Miles Erech Shechekim in New York, Mevachamish Miles Erech Oz in New York, Yashasha Mazal Maida Bel Shabbos. So it all depends on the degrees of the sun. So the time that it takes for the mazel to traverse, the time it takes for the sun to traverse from, let's say, 75 degrees. Well, actually, that's the time for the sixth hour is from 75 to 90 degrees, because each hour we know that we divide everything to 360 degrees. Over the course of 24 hours, the sun goes around to 360 degrees, and each hour is 15 degrees. So the time that it takes for the sun to traverse 15 degrees of the horizon of the arc overhead, 15 degrees that the sun moves, that's the definition of an hour. And from 75 to 90 degrees is the time of Mazel Tzedek, and from 90 degrees to 105 degrees is the time of Mazel Maida. And who cares that it's that the time of the hours on our clocks is a little, it changes, that it's not exactly 60 minutes, it could be a drop more, a drop less. Because the time of the mazalis is according to the path of the sun and not according to the length of hours on our watches. So what he seems to be saying here is very dense and very bekitzer, what he says in the name of his grandfather, but let's try to unpack it a little. So we know that in Torah, time is governed by the sun, except for months that are not governed by the sun. But we'll see. But it's actually, even months, it's not purely based on the moon. It's when the moon meets the sun. Because the sun, besides for moving the 360 degrees, also moves about a degree. So the moon, the moon has to catch up to where the sun is now, not just where the sun was, when it started its cycle. So the full cycle of the moon is actually less than 29 and a half days. But in order for the moon, the time it takes from the moon, from, let's say, the moon and the sun start here, and now the sun is over here. So the moon has to catch up, not just to here, but to over here. So that takes 29 and a half days approximately. So, but generally, the whole concept of time in halacha is governed by the sun. So similarly, the mazalis and the time of the Shlita mazalis don't depend on an arbitrary clock that we use, and they don't depend on any physical motion of the mazolas themselves, because as we know, they all have different cycles. Some have cycles that are longer than the sun, some have cycles shorter than the sun. So rather, the time of the memshala of the mazolas is dependent solely on the motion of the sun. And to understand that, there's a whole debate among Rishonim. The Tzemach Tzedek is ma'arich about it at length in the beginning of Sefer Chakira, about how the spheres turn each other. You have the outside sphere that makes a full revolution every day, and it drags along the other spheres within it, and then each sphere has its own revolution. But we're not going to get into that because that gets very complicated very quickly, understanding Kiddush and the whole system of the galgalim, the spheres, and how each the different models, whether they're like onion peels, whether they're attached, whether each one moves on its own. The mashal given is it's like if you're walking on a ship that's moving or a train that's moving. So you have the motion of the ship, and you have the motion that you went from one end of the ship to the other. So the same thing with the galgalim. So you have the outside galgal moves the entire 360 degrees and takes everything with it every day. Then you have within that other galgalim that moves slower, and each one affects the other, whether they're attached or not attached. So that if you want to see the whole Chakira, you can look it up and say for Chakira from Tzemach Tzedek. But what's negat to us is that we're focused solely on the cycle of the sun, and that's how we determine times, mazalis, for all purposes, and even the Kiddush, which is based on the moon cycle. It's not based on the moon cycle itself, but rather the moon cycle in relation to the sun. The Mevod is where the moon is right under the sun. So based on that, it makes sense that the time of the mazolis should be calculated from Chatzei Samiti, which is the astronomical time, because that's the time that the sun, you divide up the day into 24 from one Chatzais to the next Chatzais, and each of 1/24 of the period from one Chatzais to the next is what we consider an hour, and in that hour, the mazalis switch off. So basically, he's saying that what the Rebbe said in the earlier letter, 60 minutes, doesn't mean exactly 60 minutes. It's just we divide hours into 60 minutes. So on our clocks, we divide into exactly, we have a fixed minute, and 60 of those fixed minutes equals an hour, and 24 hours equals a day, or 24-hour period, day and a night. Whereas in halacha, it works the other way around. The day is 1/24. I'm sorry, the day is from one chatzais to the next chatzais, which could be in our time 24 hours plus a minute, or a fraction of a minute, or 24 hours minus a fraction of a minute. Then you take that time period, you divide it up into 24. That's halachic hours, shai Shabbos, not shai zmanis, of course. These are shai Shabbos, but that's the definition of a shah shava in halacha. And then you take that shah shava and you divide it up into 60 minutes, and then you have halakim and all that. So that's one way of approaching this question. Is that understood? Is there anything that I need to elaborate on, or?
You're doing great, Ali.
Thank you. Just want to make sure everybody's with me. So that's one approach, is to focus on the actual mazalis, and so it seems Shalei Marazav was previously arguing the opposite, that it follows Chatzei Samtzai. Based on Rebbe's answer, he changed his mind, and he came to the conclusion that it follows the sun cycle, which makes a lot of sense once you learn Kiddush HaChedesh. But I don't want to get down another rabbit hole with Kiddush HaChedesh, exactly how we calculate the cycles and the galgalim. So let's just leave it at that. But the bottom line is, according to this understanding, which is very reasonable, it seems that the real time of the Mamshala of the Mazalis is from Chatzei Samiti to the next Chatzei Samiti, divided by 24, and that's how you have the 6 to 7 is 6 hours after. Well, it could be 6 hours and a couple seconds, plus minus a couple seconds, but obviously that's we're talking mamish seconds that after Chatzei Samiti. Now, then the question becomes, why do we follow Chatzeis Antzoi? So that Rebbe already said that since Chatzeis Amiti is hard to determine, especially where we live, that it's winter time when these halachas are negeh, this minhag is negeh, and therefore, and people are busy out of Shabbos, so the minhag became that we do from Chatzeis Antzoi, we follow the clock. Now, the question is, first of all, when did the minhag become that way? And we already explained why minhag would trump the way it really should be. We saw that at length in the Maril, and we saw the Tesis Yom Tov took the same approach to the Bush, Tzemach Tzedek, Akadmin. They all take the approach that in these matters of sakana, we say Shem P'sayim Hashem and Dashu Barabim, since people, whatever the commonly accepted practice, that's what's kevea, that establishes the halacha or the minhag, as opposed to the way it really should be. So since the minhag became from Chatzeis Antzoi, so that's what we go with. Now, just it seems in the first letters from Tafshin Dazayin, the Rebbe doesn't mention Chatzeis Antzoi. Maybe that's what the Rebbe meant when he says Chatzeis, but it's mashma from the letter. That letter, the Rebbe was still talking about Chatzeis Amiti, because the Rebbe says that it's easy to know when the sun is overhead. So at some point between that letter and Ramesh Levet of Zichidus, there seems to have been a little bit of a change. But on the other hand, the Rebbe told Ramesh Levet of, it seems, again, it's hard to be medayik in a lashon that's mipi hashmua, but he says that Megeit Nachem Zeger, that the Lubavitch had the makbid given. That's the first thing the Rebbe said, that they were, despite without the Rebbe writes in the Shulchan Aruch and Lubavitch, they were makbid on this minhag. And how were they makbid? By the clock. Now, what does that mean by the clock? So you would think one way of looking at it is what the Rebbe is saying now, right? That we go by Chatzeis Antzoi. So 6 hours after Chatzeis Antzoi, that's Megeit Nachem Zeger. However, it seems to me a little differently. I think that when the Rebbe said Megeit Nachem Zeger, or the Rebbe seemed to be talking about the way it was done historically, right? And then the Rebbe says later, when the time comes to Tafshin Lamed Zayin or Lamed Tes, I don't remember when these Yagdal Torah was printed, then the Rebbe says that, no, we follow Chatzeis Antzoi because that's common practice. Now, the question is, when did that common practice shift? And it's hard to know when the Rebbe, I'm not saying, I don't want to say Chashov the Rebbe changed his mind. That's not, I mean, of course the Rebbe could change his mind. There are places where we see the Rebbe did change his mind, but not here. I just want to point out that there seems to be a shift which reflects the shift in the minhag itself. So we discussed previously that the evolution of time prior to the 19th century, to the mid to late 19th century, time was kept based on astronomic time was based on Chatzeis Amiti, meaning even though clocks and watches have been around a long time, they were adjusted every day to match noon, actual noon. So every day at noon, people would look up, oh, the sun's at noon, let's set our clock. Well, I mean, most people didn't have clocks and watches those days, only very wealthy people, but they had the clock tower, and somebody was in charge every day of adjusting the clock tower to set it exactly to 12 o'clock every day at noon. That was the only time there was. So it wasn't even shaykh for there to be a minhag from Chatzeis Antzoi, because nobody knew what Chatzeis Antzoi was. I mean, the concept existed, of course. It's discussed in early Sfarim when it talks about various measures and time and all that. It's like, obviously they knew the Chatzeis changed every day, right? They were changing their clocks, or even before clocks. I mean, they knew it. Some days it was later, some days it was earlier, but it didn't really register in their lives because their lives were governed by their time was governed by the sun, and whenever the sun was overhead, that was 12 o'clock. It didn't really matter. There was no reason to have a fixed clock that didn't change. It was much more convenient to change the clock, and that way you could tell how do people tell time. Either if they were in town, they looked up at the sun at the clock tower, once those became widespread. But before that, and also after that, when people were out in the fields and in the villages, all you had to do was look up, and people were used to it. It came natural to people to estimate the time based on the position of the sun. So, before that, they had actual sundials going back even further. And actually, sundials were still in use at the time of the Alter Rebbe, as, of course, is a famous story. It's brought down in Beis Rebbe, I believe, that with Alter Rebbe, when he was by his father-in-law, and there was the local count there, the local paritz, that he had a whole estate, and there was a problem with the sundial, and Alter Rebbe figured out why certain hours the sundial wasn't showing the time, because somebody built something on a mountain in the distance, and that was interfering with the shadows. So you see that the time was still kept by sundials. So the point is, this whole rabbit hole we went down in terms of time, prior to railroads and telegrams, when they had to have a standardized time, there was really no chatzai sansai in terms of day-to-day life, and everything was from chatzai samiti. So even if we count, never mind shais manias, but even if we're counting shais Shabbos, they were counted from chatzais. So there couldn't have been an early minhag that was from chatzai sansai. But once clocks were fixed, which was as the railroad became spread all over the world in the mid to late 19th century. So they had to have a fixed schedule. They couldn't adjust the train times based on each place's chatzais, right? So they had to make a fixed time, and each place had a schedule based on, and couldn't change also every day based on how chatzais changes. So it was originally was called railroad time as opposed to astronomic time. Railroad time is fixed. Now, I'm not even talking about time zones, before time zones. But in each place, 12 o'clock became fixed as the chatzais hansai. Instead of adjusting every day, and that's how we have the modern clock that has a fixed 24 hours, rather than basing it on chatzais every day. So once this happened, apparently it became much easier, as the Rebbe says, that there are some difficulties. On one hand, once upon a time, it was easy to know what chatzai samiti is. People were in tune with the sun. They would look up whenever the sun's overhead. Nevertheless, the Rebbe points out that there are practical issues. First of all, this whole issue applies in the winter, and in the winter, it's frequently cloudy. Second of all, people are busy preparing for Shabbos, and it's a pain in the neck to go find out each day what time is chatzais, especially now that we're not in tune with the sun. So then we'd have to check the calendar every Friday, find out exactly what time chatzais was, or hang up a sign in 770 in the shuls, and that way to know, in order to be able to know when 6 hours after chatzais is on that particular day. So therefore, the minhag became as we get late and zeger. Now, late and zeger means according to the local clock, which also has which is something that has an achiza in the natural order, right? It's not the chatzais amtzai is not just some random thing. That's the midpoint of the chatzais for that place. So, but then later, as we saw in the very late 19th century and early 20th century, still shifting, really crystallized during World War I, and right afterwards, where the entire world was divided into time zones, and then you have an additional problem. Besides, that's how you have three. So you see that these three possible shittas and how to understand Shashvius are actually different historical periods, really, where before before railroad time, there was only chatzais amiti in a practical level. Once you had railroad time, then you had the zeger based on the local time. But then once you have time zones, so then you have the third option of following the time that's on the clock on your wall based on your local time zone, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with nature. It's purely an arbitrary convention that was agreed to by that the world agreed to about 130 years ago. So it's just interesting to note, and that's really one of the purposes of the shir, is to see how halacha, people think that halacha, that historicizing halacha somehow diminishes it, but that's very, very far from the truth, quite the opposite. I think looking at halacha, a sterile bubble, without understanding how it plays out in the real world and how it played out over time, gives you a very cramped understanding of halacha. I think you really see the richness of halacha and its development when you look at it in the historical context. So I hope to illustrate that in this shir. This share writ large, not this particular share specifically. So it's so we see that these three options that were presented to the Rebbe correspond to 3 time periods. Now, the question is, what do we do with Pel Mamash? So we have the Rebbe's. Before I get to that, I just wanted to. There's an amazing sikha, the Sikha Tazayin, it's printed at the end of the Sourcebook. I would urge everyone to learn it inside, be mine in it. Very Geshmaka sikha, which is very illustrative of the Rebbe's Shitta B'chlal in Kol HaTorah Kula. The Rebbe's whole ideology is, I think, one of the Yesodis, maybe even you could say, it's hard to say the Yesod, but it's really very fundamental to the Rebbe's approach to everything, to the whole world. That there's truth, and then there's truth with a capital T, and ultimate truth is only Torah. What we see as truth in this world, reality, is a pale shadow of the true reality, which is the reality in the upper realms, which is reflected much more accurately in Torah. You see that in the Rebbe's approach to science in Torah. You see that in the Rebbe's throughout the Rebbe's within Torah itself, how the Rebbe approaches difficulties. Where Torah is keveya the mitzias, the real reality is Torah. That's the way that's the ultimate truth. Now, sometimes it comes down in a way we can perceive with our physical senses, and sometimes it gets distorted. So if we see something different than the way it appears in Torah, it's because it's our problem. It's distorted to us. It's because we're not zeichet to see the true reality. And it's very negea to what we're talking about here, how Torah is kevea reality, because this whole thing we're talking about the mazoas and the hilucha mazoas and how it has to do with the sun, it gets very confusing and very abstract. Especially when you start talking about Malach and Tzai, which we spent the whole previous year on, how we're kevea Rosh Hashanah based on the Malach and Tzai, that if the Moed based on the Malach and Tzai, the average Moed comes out exactly at Chatzais, after Chatzais, you push off Rosh Hashanah sometimes even 2 days. So that's really difficult to understand. But then the Rebbe goes on at length about the different kufas. Why I really would urge everyone to learn the sikha inside. I don't think we have enough time to go through it. It's a very deep sikha. But the nekuda of the sikha is that the Rebbe talks about why we have the tkufa Shmuel that also has a mitzias in Torah, and the Rambam brings it down la'alacha. Even though we have the Tkufa Ravada, that's more accurate, because as we said, Tkufa Shmuel is 300. The year is 365 days and a quarter, whereas the Tkufa Ravada is the entire 19-year cycle divided into months and years. So each year is 1/19 of the entire cycle. I'm sorry, because we have every year, but the months, meaning you have, I believe it's 235 months in the 19-year cycle, if I remember correctly, and each month is one fraction of that. Of course, some months are longer than others. We have some months are 29 days and some months are 30 days. But over the average, they all average out to this total of the 19-year cycle. So why do we need Tkufa Shmuel? And even more so, we see that Tkufa Shmuel still plays a big role in halacha in terms of Bekas Hachama, which we make according to the Tkufa Shmuel, and in terms of the halachas of the Tkufas that we talked about. So the nekuda of the Rebbe's explanation is that really, when we talk about tkufis and all these things, all this manim, and it's really the way it is l'mayla. That's and the Rebbe relates it to the machlekes of if the world was created in Nisan or in Tishrei, that Nisan was created in Machshava. So the way it is l'mayla, and the same thing with the meilad of the Levana, the way it is l'mayla, the Rebbe relates it also to the din that if Bezdin made a mistake or Mekadosh the wrong day, it's still Mekudosh. Why? Why don't we let Bezdin correct it? Even we know it doesn't match the physical reality. Or today that the calendar has shifted, Pesach isn't always during Chedesh Aviv. It's not always during. I mean, there distinguishes between Nisan that always has to be within Kufas Nisan, which has to be in the spring, meaning the spring has to start before the end of Nisan, which although with the shift in the calendar, eventually it won't be that way based on our calendar, but that doesn't happen until after the 6,000th year. So I believe that's pointed out already by the Rishonim that the calendar was established in a way that Rav Ada's calendar that it was established. I'm sorry, it was the calendar was established by Rafil Anasi, approximately 250 years after the Churban, right after the completion of the Talmud Yerushalmi. So, but based on the Tkufa Rav Ada, the Cheshbon is based on the Tkufa Rav Ada, and Shainim already point out that the way Hill set up Hill Anasi set up the calendar was in order so that up until the year 6000, the beginning of spring will always be during Nisan. But nevertheless, there's two things. There's having at least the Kiddush of it, and then there's also that Pesach should be approximately the same time every year. And then it goes into it at length. We don't have time to go over the whole sikha. I just want to point out that in a nutshell, the bottom line is that the Rebbe says that really the way it comes out in Torah, that's the true time. That's the way it is with Ma'ilad. The way it comes down here, when we see the Ma'ilad, is a reflection of the way the Ma'ilad really is with Ma'ilad. So even if Bezdin were Makadosh a different day, or if the Tkufa is off, based on the Cheshbenis that we follow the Tkufa Shmuel, that's just that we weren't Zeicha, that the way it is L'mayla is reflected in this world in the way that we perceive, the Gashmis. But it doesn't change. The true time is the time that Bezdin was Makadosh. That's the way it is L'mayla. That's Taka, the correct Meilad, in ultimate truth. So that's also the same thing with the Tkufa Shmuel, even though Tkufa Rabada is more accurate. But Tkufa Shmuel also has a place in Halacha. And not only that, the Rebbe says that even in things that are Meilush Chedesh is a spiritual thing. But we're talking about Tkufa, which is related to the seasons, it has to do with the physical reality. Nevertheless, we don't follow the actual solstice and when the season starts. We follow the Tkufa based on the Cheshbon of Shmuel, which is a Cheshbon of Teda. And that's how we pass on Avacham. That's how we make a bracha also on Birkas Hachama, even though Birkas Hachama is based on our seeing the sun, the Gashmias. And it's related to its being in the same place when it was created. But we don't make it when it reaches that place and based on the most accurate astronomical calculations. Rather, we make the bracha based on when it comes out according to the Tkufa Shmuel. Because again, the Psak Havacha is Emes La'amite. That's the real Nekuda here. And it's very fundamental to the Rebbe's whole worldview. That Torah creates the Metzias. And Torah it goes both ways. Torah creates reality. Of course, we heard from the Rebbe countless times about Pesua Chezers, that Torah literally creates physical reality. And even more than that, Torah reflects ultimate reality. So getting back to this, so we can, you can ask questions from today till next year. Why the Mazolas, are they Shaismanis, are they Shaishavas? At the end of the day, whatever Torah is Keveah. And of course, minhag Yisrael, Torah, that's part of Torah, is what the Klal Yisrael does. And especially in these matters of Inyane Sakana, where we have the cloud that we saw in the Gemara, even the Dasha Bar Rabin. So therefore, the common practice, and that's what we saw also in the Maril, and the Tesis Yomtiv, and the Uvush, and the Samach Tzadakad, they all were Samech on the common practice, even though it was incorrect. It was based on a minhag Tos. Nevertheless, they said, they continued the common practice, and based on this principle that Dashu Barabim, and that creates a reality. That is the reality of Torah. So I think that makes it easier to understand. It's not directly related to what we're talking about, but it's a very Geshmaka Inyan, and it really helps us understand this whole thing, how we don't look at reality in the abstract. We're looking at reality through the lens of Torah. That's the ultimate reality. And part of Torah is minhag Yisrael, and given the Dashul Baram, that's all part of Torah, and that creates the reality of when Mazel Ma'idim is Shelet. So to summarize, we have a clear instruction from the Rebbe that we follow the Chatzei Samtzai, 6 Shoy Shabbos from Chatzei Samtzai until 7 Shoy Shabbos after Chatzei Samtzai. Nevertheless, and here again, I want to add something. This is my personal speculation. Ula Yashleima, that as we saw in the Maril, we go back to the Maril and the way that Tzemach Tzedek Kadmon explained the Maril wrote that even though he directed continuing the common practice, not to change the common practice, to make it more correct, nevertheless, the Maril writes that for himself, he was makpid both ways. Mishnei Svekis. And Tzemach Tzedek Kadmon explained that what the Maril means is that he was makpid on the true kufa based on the cheshbon, the way it should be done, which is from Chatzos, which could be either a few hours before the commonly observed kufa, which was based on the cheshbon from Shkia, or a few hours after, depending whether it was winter or summer, because obviously in the winter it's going to be earlier because they're counting from Shkia instead of, and Shkia is before 6 o'clock, and in the summer it will be later because Shkia is after 6 o'clock. So for himself, the Ma'aril was still cheshish to the way it really should be, even though his psak for the public was to do it the way it was commonly done. So Ula Yashleimar, to go back to the Chiddush or Moshe Levertov, it seems a little difficult to understand at first. And in fact, he himself, as he writes here, had a hard time understanding it, and he consulted with several people to try to understand what the Rebbe was saying. The Rebbe said, "Beget nachan zeger," and then the Rebbe added over mehitzach. But we're careful. What does that mean? But we're careful. If we follow the clock, we follow the clock. What is but we're careful? So Ula Yashleimar, and this would also perhaps explain if Taka it's Meduyak, what the Rebbe Groner wrote, and what I heard from Ashpakim, that the Rebbe was himself cheshish to all the shittas, all three, even the one he negated. And perhaps that's what the Rebbe was hinting to Rabbi Levertov. He didn't want to say it as a psak because, like the Rebbe was going in the footsteps of the Maril. The psak that the Rebbe gave to the public is to do like everybody else does, to follow the common minhag. Nevertheless, over mehitzach, the Rebbe is hinting, perhaps, again, this is speculation, my personal speculation. I haven't heard this from anyone. It just seems to me that perhaps the Rebbe is hinting that there's room to also be mahadir according to the real time, which is from Chatzos Amiti, and maybe even according to the third shitta, since a lot of people in practice. I mean, it's interesting because the two possible hidurim here are diametrically opposed. On one hand, perhaps the Rebbe is saying to be mahadir the way it really should be, and perhaps the way it was in the past, not perhaps, certainly the way it was before railroad time, that was practiced from Chatzos Amiti. So that's one direction where we could have a hidur. And the other direction to have a hidur is based on this mistake that people made, that they actually follow the clock. But B'Pel, we see till today, if you ask around, I think a very large percentage of chassidim that keep this minhag and never spend time trying to understand it and getting to the bottom of it, they just follow 6 to 7 on the clock. If you do a poll, I'm sure you'll see, or ask your friends, I'm sure you'll see that many still do that till today. And it's not just from ignorance. As we discussed earlier, several very prominent Rabbanim paskin that way. So there is room for that minhag too. I mean, if everybody started doing that, the Rebbe would say that that's the way it should be done because we follow common practice. But anyone know the Ben Amram, obviously, bottom line is we do like the Rebbe says from Chatzos Amtzai. But nevertheless, perhaps, I'm underlining 10 times the word perhaps, there's room to be mahadir to also count from Chatzos Amiti, which usually is earlier in the time of year when this is when it's most shaykh to make Kiddush between 6 and 7. Around usually it's around January when you're coming home from shul early, and Chatzos gets early very quickly after it zeroes out in December, and then in January it's early until February it goes another way. So, or maybe I'm mixing it up. Maybe it was in December that it's early. But anyway, the point is that I know sometimes people rush home to make Kiddush before 6 o'clock, and I don't want to disturb anyone's shalom bayis here. But nevertheless, perhaps there is room that if it's possible, easily, obviously it's not something you have to make people wait for you, but if it can easily be observed, here we see here that when it gets earlier and later. So January is later. Yeah, January, so December, I'm sorry. So November, December, right? That's before it starts getting, the days start getting later in December. So in October, November, that's really the time when we have the early Shabbosim, and Chatzos is around 11:40. So there's room to say that you should be makbid from 5:40 till 7. But again, this is all derech efsher and hidurim. But the bottom line, we have the Rebbe's Heira that we do from Chatzos Amtzai. Any questions?
Yes. Yes.
But
So how would you determine at a practical level Chatzei Sensei on any given Friday?
any given Friday, I mean, Chatzei Sensei by definition is not on any given Friday. Chatzei Sensei is the average.
So what would it be? This Friday? What's Chatzei Sensei?
Same time it was last Friday, same time it's going to be next Friday,
Which is?
depending on your place. So there's a link in the source book that gives you a link to a website where you could check Chatzei Sensei based on your location, or you can just check when Chatzei is on one of the 4 days when the equation of time zeroes out, which is December 25, April 15, June 13, and September 1st. Those are 4 days when Chatzei Sensei will always be will correspond with Chatzei Amiti.
Interesting. What do you know on what page of the source book this link is? Do you recall?
Link, let's see, in the updated version 2 of the source book, it's on page 56. So give you Chatzei Sensei for various places around the world.
Interesting. And also,
Now,
and the 6 hours that follow, those are the 6 Shais Kvuos, right?
yes, 6 fixed hours. I mean,
60 minutes.
as we just discussed earlier, that it's not exactly 60 minutes because we're measuring from one Chatzei to the next Chatzei if we're using. I'm sorry, no, I'm sorry. That's Chatzei Amiti. When you're doing Chatzei Sensei, yes, it's exactly 6 hours. 6 hours from Chatzei Sensei until 6 o'clock. Now, I just want to urge everyone, please, to we spoke about this last year. Now that we've concluded the series, I have to pick another topic, and we have several options, as discussed last time. We could either take another topic like this and do a deep dive on some interesting topic, or we can just start somewhere in Shulchan Aruch and go ala seder. We can start either from the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, Birkas Hanehanin, Shabbos, whatever the Elam wants. Or we can just pick topics. We can do something seasonal. We can do something related to Purim next week. I was thinking maybe to do some shorter topics, so I don't lose everybody on the way. And maybe after a few shurim, we can go back to a deep dive. Some topics that I was suggested, for example, is the shurim coming up on Pesach. Everybody talks about Kazayas, Kebeya, all these shurim. So we can explore the shurim and halacha in light of the directions of Rabbeinu and Sienu. There's quite a bit on that. We could talk about one topic I'd like to do at some point is how we determine where to hang the mezuzah, Heketzir, because I think that's a very, very misunderstood topic. But that would take probably a lot more than 6 shurim because we'd have to go through the whole halachas of how you determine where you hang a mezuzah, and then based on that, try to understand Shittas Rabbeinu and Sienu based on that. It's less esoteric, but it may be a little more complicated. So please send me your suggestions. Email mashiachnow@gmail.com, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, anywhere you find me. I'd very much appreciate any feedback you have, any suggestions, and Mitzvah Hashem, we will take up a new topic next week. Kol Tov.
Ellie.
1 second.